Gertrude Eileen Trevelyan is the greatest English novelist of the 20th century that no one has ever heard of. Nearly 80 years after her death, her work is finally beginning to be rediscovered. But her life offers a cautionary tale for any writer who wants his or her work to be remembered. For decades, my hobby has been exploring the work of long-forgotten writers. Since 2006, I've been writing about them on my Neglected Books website. I first came across Gertrude Trevelyan's name when I read her novel Appius and Virginia in 2018. I was so impressed by the quality of Trevelyan's writing and by the extent to which she had become utterly forgotten that I searched out the rest of her books. It wasn't easy or cheap to find them. In some cases, there are fewer than a dozen copies to be found anywhere in the world, and these only available in archives like the British Library. In the course of discovering Trevelyan's work, I found myself digging into the facts about her life as well. Unlike someone like Virginia Woolf or Sylvia Plath, who left behind thousands of pages of notebooks, diaries, letters, and manuscripts, and who were part of a large network of writers and artists of their time, Gertrude Eileen Trevelyan left behind almost no trace aside from her books. She was born in Bath on the 17th of October, 1903, the first and only surviving child of Edward and Eleanor Trevelyan. Gertrude's father had inherited a modest fortune, which enabled him to live a life of quiet leisure, writing, gardening, belonging to fraternal organizations. Gertrude grew up in a small, comfortable, and conventional family. She attended Princess Helena College in London as a day student. She went on to attend Lady Margaret Hall, then one of the few women's colleges in Oxford. There she began to cultivate what she called her taste for misanthropic reflection. As she later wrote, while at Oxford, she maintained without effort a position of total obscurity, academic as well as social. In June 1927, however, this slight, quiet, and antisocial undergraduate made international headlines when she became the first woman chosen for the Newdigate Prize, a prize given each year for the best poem written by an Oxford student on a set topic. The novelty of the award far outweighed the merits of her poem, Julia, Daughter of Claudius. The story was published in English-speaking papers around the world, from Adelaide, Australia, to Walla Walla, Washington. The actual presentation of her award, however, was eclipsed, literally. For the first time in its history, Oxford's annual awards ceremony, the Insignia, was delayed one day to allow students and faculty to witness the first solar eclipse visible from England in over a century. When the ceremony was held the following day, most of the male students and a good number of the faculty members were absent. The women students at Oxford, however, were there in force to cheer on their fellow student. After leaving Oxford, Trevelyan moved to London. In 1931, she took a flat at number 107 Lansdowne Road in Notting Hill. And there, aside from her books, her story effectively comes to an end. She had precisely the prerequisites Virginia Woolf had called for in a room of one's own: talent, £500 a year, and a room of her own. With these, in the space of 8 years, she wrote 8 novels of striking originality and stylistic invention. Her first novel, Appius and Virginia, was published in 1932. Its story was unlike anything that had ever been written by a woman novelist before. Appius and Virginia is the story of a bold and mad experiment. Virginia Hutton, a parson's daughter and university graduate in her 40s, purchases a secluded house in a small country village where she intends to put a theory to test. She purchases a orangutan she names Appius, takes him to her house, and there raises him in complete isolation, as if he were a human child. She dresses him as a boy, teaches him to eat with fork and spoon, tries to teach him the alphabet and how to read. Appius gradually learns how to mimic the behaviors that Virginia praises, but he remains fundamentally mystified by these exercises. For Virginia, this experiment is more than just a test. It is her effort to avoid becoming just another forgotten aging woman on the streets of London. All her willpower, all her suggestive force, was not too much to expend on this experiment, for if it succeeded, she would indeed have achieved something. She would have created a human being out of purely animal material and forced evolution to cover in a few years stages which unaided it would have taken eons to pass, and have proved not only the truth of the evolution theory, but the boundless possibilities of environment and early training. It must succeed. She knew, obscurely, inarticulately, that if this experiment failed, her existence would no longer be justified in her own sight. The newly awakened need of her being to create would be frustrated utterly. She would go back to Earl's Court and her bed-sitting room, gas fire and griller, separate meters, to her consumption of novels from the lending library, her bus rides to the confectioner's, her nightly sipping of conversation and coffee in the lounge, to middle age in a ladies' residential club. Each year a little older, a little stouter or a little thinner, a little less quickly off the bus. Come along there, please. Come along. And the struggle with umbrella and parcels through the ranks of inside passengers, and the half-compassionate, half-contemptuous hand of the conductor, grimy and none too gentle, as she clambers down the swaying steps onto the sliding pavement. Each year a little less bright in the after-dinner conversation, a little less able to remember the novels she has read, a little less able to find a listener, a little less able to live, and yet no more ready for death. For Trevelyan as well, Appius and Virginia was a bold experiment. In her case, it was an imaginative experiment, an attempt to apply the stream of consciousness technique to the thoughts of an animal mind. Here, for example, is how Appius perceives the sight of the moon from his bedroom window. He hissed derisively at the sinking fire and climbed onto Virginia's desk, and thence onto the windowsill above it. Turning his back on the room, he found that he was standing up against a square of whiteness, very cold and very smooth. Very white, dull white, as high as himself as he stood there fingering the pane, and splashing over onto a dark patch above him which had tiny yellow dots on it. Very cold. His thoughts had no words. Blackness. Big moving things. Big still things. Big black things. Stillness. Whiteness. Dazzle. When I first heard about Appius and Virginia, I assumed it was a comic novel, something along the lines of John Collier's 1930 novel, His Monkey Wife. Instead, it was something far more profound, for beneath the surface of this story about a woman trying to turn an ape into a human being, there was something deeply moving, a tragedy of two souls utterly incapable of understanding each other. The response of critics to Appius and Virginia set the pattern for how Trevelyan's subsequent work would be received. James Agate, perhaps the dean of British critics at the time, hated it. He found the story absurd and condemned the book as pretentious, puling twaddle. But others, like Gerald Gould, recognized just how bold Trevelyan's experiment was, and how well she succeeded in realizing it. The next year, Trevelyan published Hothouse. Drawing on Trevelyan's experiences at Oxford, it was set in a fictional version of her own college, Lady Margaret Hall. Hothouse followed one impressionable young undergraduate, Mina Cook, through her 3 years at Oxford. Trevelyan's view of the atmosphere of the women's colleges, then strictly limited in number and tightly controlled, is obvious from the book's epigraph taken from Chambers' Dictionary. Trevelyan depicts the emotionally overheated culture of the college, where every student was under constant observation, and where every action is subject to discussion at the daily cocoa parties. She emphasizes the fragmentary, unstable nature of Mina's thoughts through short phrases and heavy use of ellipses. Trevelyan's third novel, As It Was in the Beginning, was her boldest experiment in the use of the stream of consciousness technique. The entire book takes place within the mind of a woman as she lies in her private room in a nursing home, having suffered a massive stroke. From the opening pages, she finds herself moving further and further away from the reality around her. That's right, cover up the skin and bones. Tie them up in their bag and wrap them round with the sheet. Bundle them out of sight. I don't want to look at them. I suppose they're mine, but they're not I. As the story moves forward toward her eventual death, her thoughts take her back further and further through her life. In the book's final pages, she runs backwards through her earliest memories. Rock, rock, and veil on face, and suck, and wet in mouth, and blue ceiling with white dots, and bump, bump, and greenness, and big people, and suck, and wet, and bump, and blue, and empty, and want, and full of nothing, and cold, and wet, and want, and warm, and nothing, and want, and want, and want, and want, alone, and alone, and alone. Trevelyan's fourth novel, A War Without a Hero, is her least successful book. Set mostly on a small Channel island, its story told of the emotional and cultural conflict that results when the London woman takes a room with a fisherman's family to wait out the initial scandal after her divorce. While some reviewers praised Trevelyan's psychological insights, the book was generally dismissed by most, none more harshly than A.G. MacDonald, who wrote that it was liable to induce insanity and made him want to go out and shoot himself. 2 years later, Trevelyan shifted her focus entirely. In 2000 Million Manpower, she drew from John Dos Passos' example in his USA trilogy and interspersed newspaper headlines, magazine advertisements, radio broadcasts, and newsreels in her story of a young couple, Catherine and Robert, and their journey through the economic and social disruptions of the 1920s and 30s. Conquest of peace is imminent. Wall Street. Soviet plane completes first flight, Moscow, New York. In Italy, successful trial, 6,000 horsepower bombing plane. Panic strikes New York stock market. Prosperity, no danger here. Gas suicide. Air crash, train crash, bus crash, plane crash. New race through land control. Progress. Catherine in particular comes to symbolize the new consumer culture. She insists they buy a car, a house in the suburbs, a vacuum cleaner, a refrigerator, all the latest appliances, and all on the installment plan. But then the depression hits. Robert loses his job. They give up their house, and they move into a tenement flat in the East End. Trevelyan follows Robert as he trudges into London each day, in search of work he knows won't be found. Her description of the growing weariness and loss of self that results from unemployment is as powerful as anything written by George Orwell in the same period. He stared in front of him for a moment and wondered what he had to hurry about, and slumped again. He wasn't part of the machine. It didn't want him. It wouldn't have him. Waste product. Couldn't use him. That's why he didn't eat, because he wasn't part of the machine. No, he wasn't part of the machine because he didn't eat. Well, he wasn't part of the machine, that was it. He could hear civilization rumbling in the distance, going on without him. Flying hamburger does 90 miles an hour. 600-mile oil pipeline laid across the Persian desert. French architect visualizes bomb-proof cities of the future. And here he was, sitting on a soapbox, on a patch of waste ground. Her sixth novel, William's Wife, showed how one man's psychological degradation of his wife could continue even after his death. After his first wife dies, William Chirp, a prosperous grocer, marries Jane, a former lady's maid. She soon discovers that he is tight-fisted and wants her more as an object than as a partner. It was almost as if he had a suspicious look about him sometimes, as if he were watching her. Not that he looked at her much to take any notice over her. He'd never done that. But the way he'd turn round sharp now and then when he was sitting over the fire and give her a look with his eyes half shut up. And he'd stick his pipe back in the other side of his mouth and then go through the accounts at the end of the week, balancing the bills on his knees one at a time, grunting over them. You'd think it was a matter of 1,000,000 instead of a few shillings, counting out his change. It wasn't nice, the way he counted every penny, as if he couldn't trust her. By the time William dies, his parsimony and suspicion have taken over Jane's worldview. She sells their house and moves with her furniture into a series of ever smaller and more dismal flats as she moves closer to the heart of London. Soon her days are consumed by scouring the market stalls in search of ever cheaper food. She begins buying scraps sold as cat food instead of cuts of meat from the butchers. Eventually she takes to searching for bits of produce discarded by sellers and to foraging in bins. And then one day, all unexpected, she had a bit of luck, and a thing you would never have thought of. One Saturday night it was, halfway up Clappington Street on the left-hand side, near the corner by the public convenience. And she was having all she could do to make her way through the crowds that would keep banging into her things, all in such a hurry nowadays, and keep her eye on the stalls as well. For all her trouble, she'd get pushed out time and again, almost off the pavement. When suddenly, looking down, what should she see but a most lovely cauliflower, rolled right down in the gutter. Really, it seemed a shame not to pick it up. And get down and pick it up she did, for all they might bump and push, pretending they couldn't get past. There, a lovely big cauliflower that would cost 6 pence any day of that time of the year, and that she would never think of buying. What had rolled off a stall, or someone had thrown it out, though it was only the teensiest bit gone on one side. Well, at the finish, into her bag it popped, and if the gutter was where you found good food for nothing, the gutter she'd watch in future, and not ashamed to do it either. 1938 also saw the publication of Trevelyan's boldest experiment with structure. The theme, in theme with variations, is entrapment. Her variations, however, are played out through the stories of three characters who never meet: a manual laborer, an intelligent and ambitious schoolgirl, and a lonely and poorly educated housewife. Each becomes trapped through different circumstances. The working man, first through injury and then unemployment. The young girl through her family's psychological dependence. And the wife through a combination of ignorance and physical isolation. Trevelyan's anger with the economic and social conditions of her time is clear from the book's opening line. Samuel Smith was the best part of 30 before anyone told him he was a wage slave. To each character, the thought recurs, I ought to do something about it. I've got to get out and do something. Yet all find themselves powerless to overcome the forces of inertia that bear down and entrap them. Trevelyan's last novel, Trance by Appointment, tells a simple and sad story. Jean, the daughter of a working-class London family, is a psychic. As she grows, her family comes to recognize this talent and introduces her to Madame Eva. Eva, who runs a fortune-telling business from a flat in Bayswater, teaches Jean how to read palms and tea leaves, conduct seances, and play the role of the mysterious, all-knowing seer. Jean marries an astrologer who sees the commercial possibilities of a trance by appointment business. And from this point forward, the story follows a familiar pattern. A bright but weak spirit finds herself unable to break free from the demands of her family and economic circumstances, and is turned in her own way into a workhorse. About a year after the publication of Trance by Appointment, Trevelyan was seriously injured when her flat on Lansdowne Road was destroyed by a Luftwaffe bomb. She was taken to her parents' house in Bath, and there she died on the 1st of March, 1941. And at that point, Gertrude Trevelyan disappeared from literary history. None of her books were reprinted. No account of English literature of the 1930s mentions her name. Her brief, brilliant career fell under a long, dark shadow of neglect. Trevelyan's story offers a cautionary tale for other writers. No matter how outstanding and original their work may be, without a network, connections, and relations with others in the literary world of their time, they risk becoming forgotten just as quickly and completely as she did. That is, unless someone comes looking for them. In Trevelyan's case, it took almost 80 years. Starting in late 2018, I've tracked down and written about all of her books. I've distilled my research into her life into a biographical article on Wikipedia. And now, with the help of the Abandoned Bookshop Press, Trevelyan's first novel, Appius and Virginia, is being brought back to print again. And now, the Eclipse of G. Trevelyan may finally be coming to an end.